Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. Show where I take your questions and answer them here in video format. A ton of questions to get into, so let's just jump into it. We're going to start with the first question of the day from Kev, who says this: is there any universe in which the Browns can get Mendoza, and is there a price that might be worth the trade? No, it looks like the Raiders are pretty locked into drafting him number 1 overall. And once a team is locked into taking a quarterback number 1 overall, there's no price that's going to get them to move off of it, because that's what they have spent the last couple of months building their team around. Like, it's immovable at that point, right? If they were waffling still on whether they wanted to take a quarterback or not, but the second that they leaked out that they were going to cut Geno Smith, told you exactly what direction that the Raiders were going to go. It's almost like a 99% certainty that Mendoza is going to go to the Raiders, and that the Raiders are going to draft him, and that they're not open to calling. You can't, in order for there to be a price, right, that's even too high, in order for there to be a price, somebody needs to be willing to sell. If nobody's willing to sell, there's no price, right? I know a lot of y'all watch wrestling, and you've heard the $1 Million Man say everybody's got a price, but that's wrestling, right? If somebody's not willing to sell, then there is no price. And it doesn't matter what the value is from the outside. The Raiders aren't willing to sell. They're going to take a quarterback. They're going to take him specifically. And they're going to take him number 1 overall. And that's kind of that. If the Browns wanted a chance to draft Mendoza, they would have had to have gotten the number 1 overall pick. And they had a chance to get the number 1 overall pick in the last 2 weeks of the season. They won both of those games. So now they're picking 6 instead of number 1. And that's how the cards laid out for the Cleveland Browns. And, instead of dwelling on that part of it, right, which is easy to dwell on. I mean, Browns fans in general have been left to stew in a lot of negativity over the last 25 years. But instead of dwelling on that, we got to play the cards that we got dealt, and deal with the hand that we have. But we can't just will in a Mendoza trade out of nowhere when the Raiders seem like they're pretty dead set on getting him at the number 1 overall selection. Now, if the Raiders get cold feet or something, he becomes available, then I think there's a conversation to be had, because the Browns would, I think, be interested. But that's not the situation that we're in. You know what I mean? Thank you for that question, though, Kev. The next question comes from Dr. Maggie, who says this: there has been an eerie quietness on Jordan Tyson. I've heard that at the combine, his medicals checked out, not to be as bad as teams feared. If that's the case, Jordan should be in the thick of the conversation at 6, just as much as Monroe, Francis, and Carnell. Thoughts? I think it depends on what bubble you're in. If Jordan Tyson is being heavily discussed at 6, if you're in local bubbles, people are going to be more attracted to talking about Carnell Tate at 6 than Jordan Tyson or Mekhi Lemon or whoever it is, Francis, right? Monroe Freeling, because Carnell Tate is a local product to local fans because he played at Ohio State. And, more on average, more Browns fans have watched more Ohio State games than any other college football team, right? That's just a fact. They're the local college team in the region, right? Ohio State is the only major college football force near the city of Cleveland. There's no local Cleveland college that's competing in football. And even the schools that are closer to Cleveland, like Akron and Kent, aren't serious football teams. So that means that a lot of people in Cleveland watch Ohio State on Saturday, which means they're more familiar with Carnell Tate than they are with Jordan Tyson, who played in the Big 12, on the West Coast, which not a lot of people stay up for them 10 o'clock games. So I think what you're dealing with is less Is Jordan Tyson a good enough prospect to be at 6? I think he's the best wide receiver prospect in the draft. If you just look at all the things combined that he does, it's like, yeah, that's the guy who has all the talent there. I think the reason you don't hear as much conversation about him, especially when it comes to local media and stuff like that, is just because people are more familiar with Carnell Tate, right? If you're saying, I want the Browns to draft the wide receiver, and you're a Browns fan in the general vicinity of Ohio, or you're listening to people who are reporting locally from Cleveland, they're going to talk more about Carnell Tate because that's what they're more familiar with. I think that's just really what's going on there. I don't think there's actually a quietness around Jordan Tyson. You talk around the league, you hear Jordan Tyson pop up at 6 all the time. It's just like, people default more to Carnell in this market for obvious reasons, in my opinion. The next question comes from C. Bates, who says this. Love the videos, Q, with the moves that Barry's made so far. What would the possibility of us trading further down with the team outside the top 13 to get us a future first? I don't think the moves in free agency have really changed what Andrew Berry's strategy is going to be for the draft. I just think it shields him more from the consequences of that strategy. What I mean is, if he didn't address the offensive line in free agency and he trades back during the draft, which he still probably would have done, we don't know if he's going to trade back in this one, but like a lot of us heavily speculate that he might. Then like the consequences of that going wrong are a lot more obvious and a lot more impactful. Now the consequences of trading back, not as impactful. So it doesn't really change whether he was going to do it or not. It just changes how big of a safety net is underneath him if he does make this move. So I think the goal for him still is, we're going to try to be within picks 7 and 13, but I don't think he's going to try to dip outside of that, because his strategy for the draft is, I want to get players of a certain tier at a certain price. And I think he wants to stay in the top 13 to make sure he gets the first tier of guys with that 6 overall pick. I think he's thinking in his mind, I have the ability to get the same tier of prospect at a number of positions at 6 than I do at 11. So if that's the case for me, I'm okay with trading back if you're looking at this from Andrew Berry's perspective. So that's kind of how I think he views it. And that's why I don't think it changes with what he's done in free agency. Maybe the comfort of everybody else in the building, it changes. But I think if you're Andrew Berry, the strategy stays the same. The next question comes from the Illumin Tattoo. I don't know. Forgive any ignorance here. I don't know how much sway Quincy had in Cleveland's offices, but based on the drafting in Minnesota and AB's improvement since he left, could there be a link to Quincy's influence in the building and the Browns' improved drafting since he left for the Vikings? It is a strange coincidence there, right? That Quincy was with AB from, let me double check this, but I believe Quincy was with Andrew Berry from 2020 to about 2022. Again, I'm going to work to confirm this. And if you look at Andrew Berry's draft, I would argue his worst drafts were in that early portion of time, right? And then all of a sudden, Quincy leaves, or at least the perception is Quincy leaves. He takes a job with the Vikings, and the Browns get much better at drafting over the next couple of years. So he was with Cleveland from 2020 to 2021. So actually, that doesn't actually line up as cleanly as I thought. Yeah, because the drafts got better not in 2022, but the drafts didn't start to get better until like maybe you could argue 23, especially the UDFA class is pretty solid. 24, we'll see how that one shakes out. A lot of it depends on Mike Hall's ability to stay healthy. And then 25 is obviously really, really good. So Quincy, he got let go. Well, he left in 2021. And then there's that 2022 draft, which is still pretty rough from my recollection off the top of my head. And then the 2023 drafts, when it started to turn around, I think the hire that lines up, whether this is coincidence or not, they hired Catherine Hickman. She was Racine, but I think she got married recently. But Catherine Hickman, who they signed, was a long time Toronto Argonauts employee, but then worked with the Philadelphia Eagles as football operations coordinator and then vice president of football operations for them. I don't know how involved she is with the draft, but I do know that she is involved with scouting. And, she was hired June of 2022, which means that the drafts that she was responsible for were 2023, 24, and 25. Those are the drafts you can point to in Andrew Berry's run where like, hey, they were much better. Even the 24 draft, which is heavily dependent on how Mike Hall performs over the next couple of years, and his ability to stay healthy, which has been a big hindrance in his ability to be productive. But those are much more sound drafts than the ones that came before it. I don't know if she is the reason for it. It might just be pure coincidence, but that is the high tier hire, the change that they've made in the front office that aligns with an improvement in the draft. It might just be that Andrew Berry got better at drafting. It might just be that like, hey, getting Jim Schwartz in there to help guide the process, help them with drafting on the defensive side of the ball. There's a number of conclusions you can come to and a number of people you can give credit to. But I don't think it's solely that like Quincy left and then he was the problem. Even though that's a compelling way to look at it, you still got to explain the 2022 draft, which Quincy was not involved in, right? Like Quincy was not there in Cleveland for the 2022 draft. He left in 2021. So, you still got to explain that one with that theory. And that's where it falls apart for me. The next question comes from Mark, who says, do you think the Browns have their eye on a QB in next year's draft, therefore will trade down this year to collect ammunition to move up next year? I think the Browns will trade down this year to try to get a first next year, but I don't automatically assume that means that they're going for a quarterback. I think they just want the extra first round picks because they need the extra first because they spent 3 years without first round picks. Like, I think they want to get and recoup that talent. As far as like trying to use it as ammunition to get a quarterback, it really depends on what kind of a pick you get, because there's a lot of teams in that 2027 draft that have multiple first round picks. Like the Browns aren't even in the ammunition race to make that kind of a move when it comes to next year's class that they need to jump into the top 5 from outside or something like that. So I tend to think that they want the extra first. I agree with you there. I don't know if that has everything to do with quarterback. I think it just has to do with just replenishing the talent from the Watson trade. That being said, they do need a quarterback. And depending on how this year goes, they may be more desperate at quarterback than they are right now, or less desperate at quarterback, right? We got some young guys on the roster. Maybe they trade for another young guy. Maybe one of those young guys works out. But also it could go the other way, right? Where those young guys definitely don't work out and then you're super desperate. So we'll see what happens, but I think they're going to try to get an extra first, but I think that has more to do with just replenishing the roster from the Watson trade than anything. C's question comes from Forky. What is Andrew Berry's leash in the organization? It seems like his trades and direction with signings have been very solid. However, there's a notion that he's still in the hot seat for multiple rough seasons. And of course, the Watson fiasco. I'm curious your thoughts on Berry's job status can withstand another potential down year. Yeah, there's this one clip, and I hope I remember, note to future Quincy. There's this clip that I saw about Jarvis Landry and Leonard Fournette, and they were discussing going to Atlanta with Deshaun Watson. And basically that thing was done. They were going to go to Atlanta. They was pretty much booked, and then something changed. I think that kind of shows you that that's a Jimmy Haslam-led decision. Like, he's the only guy who can make such a decision, and we have known Jimmy Haslam to do such things in the middle of the night, right? He did something very similar with Hugh Jackson in the past. I know people are like, well, Andrew Berry, it was his idea for the guaranteed contract. But there's a lot of ways that idea could have came about, right? It could have been something where Jimmy made up his mind. He wanted to go get Deshaun Watson. And Jimmy asked Andrew, what do you think can get it done? And Andrew said, well, if we guarantee his contract, that will probably get it done. And then Jimmy said, do it. You see how that's all still Jimmy? Right? Like, that's not Andrew pushing for it at that point once they're out. But whatever happened, right? The fact that nobody got fired directly for that trade, it tells you who was responsible for it. Because if there was somebody for Jimmy Haslam to point the finger at and blame for the trade, he would have fired them. He's Jimmy Haslam. Like, he doesn't show that much restraint. So if he felt like he got duped into this decision, if he felt like he got forced into a decision or got talked into the trade for Deshaun Watson by anybody, and that person led him astray, he would have fired that person. That's the most logical conclusion, right? Every couple of weeks, I see multiple beat reporters tweet, I can't believe somebody wasn't fired for the Deshaun Watson trade. And it's like, well, use your fucking brain. You know what I mean? Like, your brain should tell you, well, if nobody got fired, then what does that tell you about how that decision was made? Because Jimmy ain't gonna fire himself if he knows that he is himself responsible for the Deshaun Watson trade. Seems to line up clean to me. So I think that's why I don't think he has that much flack organizationally about the Deshaun Watson trade. I think it's more likely that the coaching search this year could be something that either entrenches Andrew or gets Andrew out of there. If it turns out Andrew was really wrong about something in that coaching search or really right about something in that coaching search, that's something that Andrew has more fingerprints on. Although it's debated whether Andrew got to actually hire the guy that he wanted to hire. I think Andrew's pretty safe. From everybody that I talk to, when I speak to beat reporters that I trust that are around that Cleveland situation, shout out the guys like Daniel Afuise, they seem to be pretty convinced that he's pretty tight in there. Right. It's more of a question of if Andrew's going to stay than a question of if Andrew's going to get fired. That's the vibe that I get. So I think his job security is quite fine. That being said, you have a disappointing season this year. You never know with Jimmy Haslam. He might just fire everybody just because. So it's about as secure as it can be coming off of a 5-win season. And not having much success over the last couple of years. You know what I mean? Like that's it's about as secure as it could be with 8 wins over 2 seasons. Nothing's guaranteed at that point, but he's not necessarily on the hot seat in my opinion. And I think that's because he's not really seen as the guy responsible widely for that trade. Maybe he wasn't against it enough, or maybe he didn't stop the trade, or he was neutral on it, or maybe even for it, but not for going to the lengths that it was. But I think there is an acknowledgement from ownership that part of what got them into this situation is something that was outside of the control of Andrew Berry or even Kevin Stefanski, because none of them ever got fired because of that trade. Kevin got fired, it had nothing to do with the trade. So, I think that's where you can tell that whole situation gets blamed on, like owners, like Jimmy telling people like, oh, it's a swing and a miss and just being okay with that. That's only something Jimmy can do if Jimmy felt like Jimmy was responsible. That's all I'm saying. I don't know the inner workings. We will hear rumors to the end of times about who's actually responsible. 3 people are going to write 3 different books and blame 3 different people in the next 20 years. But the reality is, if Jimmy didn't feel like he was responsible, Jimmy would have fired somebody. That's why I think Jimmy's responsible. Me Wit says this: how much of this O-line overhaul being done before this offseason is because Kevin versus the Watson contract? Looking at how aggressively we're targeting in free agency, it's clearly the top priority, but we're also spending our cap money well. This is a good question, because it's easy to say, oh, well, the offensive line got old, so they replaced it. But it is interesting that Kevin Stefanski leaves and then the offensive line gets replaced, because I think the guy that was advocating the most to keep that 2020 core offensive line together, it was Kevin Stefanski. I think the reason why the Browns didn't take offensive line seriously is because in Kevin Stefanski's analysis of the team, he told the front office that they're fine at offensive line, right? Like if they're like, let's say me and you are GM and head coach, and we're trying to put together, quote unquote, a grocery list, right? We're trying to figure out what the groceries are going to be for the Browns. Not literal groceries. We're talking about players here, right? But we're trying to put together a grocery list. If you don't tell me you need this grocery, I'm not going to get it, right? And when you look at how Kevin has talked about certain parts of his team, when you look at how these drafts have happened, what's been prioritized, what's not, it is clear to me that Kevin was betting on that offensive line continuing to maintain value. And that just did not happen. And then once Kevin leaves, you get a different analysis of the team and a different analysis of the groceries, and then you finally go and you get the offensive line. It reminds me of the change from Joe Woods to Jim Schwartz. Joe Woods, for 3 years in Cleveland, they would not draft defensive tackle, to the point to where people thought Andrew Berry hated the position. And then Jim Schwartz shows up and is defensive tackle city. We haven't stopped taking defensive tackles in the draft. It's been defensive tackle. We love defensive tackles. Somebody came in and gave a different grocery list to Andrew Berry. Andrew shot for the groceries and got defensive tackles because it wasn't on the list before. Now Kevin Stefanski leaves. After years of them neglecting the offensive tackle position, all of a sudden it feels like the offensive line was on the grocery list. You see what I'm saying? I've been saying this for a while with Kevin. I think he's bet on this offensive line. Even when I supported Kevin, I was like, I think he trusts this offensive line too much. And that's going back to like 2024 and 2023 when it wasn't popular to say that. I think Kevin he wanted this offensive line core to work out. And he kept betting on them, and they kept getting injured and getting worse. That's my 2 cents on it. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my read on it. Michael Lavinga with this question: hey, do you think our offensive lineman signings gives us the ability to be competent this year? I'm not expecting a Pro Bowl offensive line, but we need to improve enough to evaluate our skill positions. I think at some point during the year, this will be a solid offensive line, but I do think we need to be realistic about the amount of moving parts that we're putting together. A lot of guys who have not played with each other on this offensive line who need snaps together, and it's going to be a new offense for everybody. So I don't expect them to be an amazing offensive line out the gate. But I do hope that, if they have like a week 8 bye week, the post bye week stuff is going to be significantly better than the start of the season. And that by the end of the year, we're saying that the Browns have a good offensive line. That's where I hope that we are. I'm going to expect some struggles at the beginning of the season because there's a lot of moving parts here. But I think as the year goes on, this will be obviously a better offensive line than they were last year. Struggles at the beginning, understandable. Just finish strong is all I'm hoping for. But that's it for Q&A. Thank you guys for asking these questions. You guys continue to have wonderful days and even better nights. Peace.